If you have a Bible and you like to follow along on this Memorial Day, please turn in it to John chapter 1. John chapter 1. A text we've looked at, as a matter of fact, several years back on an Easter. But we're going to look at it in a little different way today. When I lived in Pennsylvania, there was a music store that I liked to go in where I had a good friend there who owned it. Good friend. And he was a really creative person beyond the fact of his music store. He was a musician, but he was also a writer. He had this big book that he'd had published. Now, it wasn't published broadly. It's one of those publishers where you can go on the internet and you get a book assembled and made for you. It obviously cost a lot because it's just one book. But he had his book of essays assembled and put together, and it sat on the counter as a big old thing, like the size of what used to be a Life magazine. Big, thick thing full of his musings, where he just said, you know, I'm going to write them down and then I'm going to let people read them. Well, he wrote one about me. And so he had it open on the page. I walked in the store and he opened it up and turned it around for me to read. And what he thought was interesting about me, which whatever is interesting about me, I don't know. You'll have to comment on that yourself. But he said, what was interesting about Rip for him was that I liked words. And he said, Rip has a set of words that he thinks are funny words. And I do. There are words that just sound funny to me. Jumbo. That's a funny word to me. I don't know why. Fuzz is another funny word. Home. That's a funny word to me. I can't explain it. I don't know why that is. Al thought it was really interesting that these things were that way. Well, even though the word sounds funny, if you think about home, it, for me, and maybe for you all, you have a connotation that connects with it such that it almost becomes like a taste or a smell. Like I remember, I can stand right here and I can close my eyes and I can remember how my grandmother's kitchen smelled when I would walk in their house. There was a certain smell from things she cooked, iced tea she was brewing on the stove. There was just and as soon as I walked in, that was the smell of my grandmother's home, and I can remember that. I can remember riding a bicycle in this region of the country when I used to long distance bike ride in the summer and ride past swamp area, and there's a smell that comes with that, and just all those implications. Well, as we think about the word home, a funny word but an interesting one, what does it mean for us in terms of salvation? What does it mean? Let's think about that as we look at the text today. In John chapter 1, I'll begin reading in verse 1. In the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God, and the Word was fully God. The Word was with God in the beginning, and all things were created by Him. Apart from Him, not one thing that was created has been created. In Him was the life, and the life was the light of all of humanity. The light shines on in the darkness, but the darkness has not mastered the light. A man came sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify about the light, so that everyone might believe through John's testimony. He himself, though, was not the light. He came to testify about the light. The true light that gives light to everyone was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world was created by Him, but the world didn't recognize Him. He came into what was His own, but His own people didn't recognize Him. But to all who have received Him, those who believe in His name, He has given the right to become God's children. Children not born by human parents, or by human desire, or by a husband's decision, but born by God. Now the Word became flesh and took up residence among us. We saw His glory, the glory of the one and the only, full of grace and truth, who came from the Father. John testified about Him and shouted out, "This was the one about whom I said, 'He who comes after me is greater than I, because He existed before I am.' But we have all received from His fullness one gracious gift after another. For the law was given through Moses, but grace and truth came about through Jesus Christ. but no one has ever seen God. The only one, himself God, who is in closest relationship with the Father, has made God known. Now, I don't know about you, but every sentence in this text almost bends under its own weight. I mean, these words, as we've been given here by John in this, what I would call a revelation straight from heaven, because we would have no way to know any of this had John not stated it this way. And this phrase, in the beginning was the Word. I don't know if you look at this word in Greek, it carries with it the idea. We use a word in our language, is. Is a funny word, I guess, but it has a specific meaning. It is what it is to be. That's what it is. It's a form of the infinitive verb to be. And in this text, what it's saying is the Word always was ising. Always existing. Always there. No beginning, no end, just is. That's so, and the Word became flesh, which is to say that the Word is God Himself. And you see this in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, Philippians chapter 2, Colossians chapter 1, the same idea that Jesus, as He walked the earth, was God Almighty in the flesh. As much as God could possibly mean in a living human being, that's who Jesus was. When it says the Word was with God, that means the Word was face to face. The imagery there in the language is face to face with God. What does that mean? It tells us something about God and ourselves as well. You know, we're creatures of relationship. We relate to one another. We relate to our children. We relate to our spouses. We relate to our friends. We relate to people in the world. Why is that? Because God was in relationship before anything else was. He was already in relationship. The Word, the Father, and the Spirit were already relating. There was a relationship established. It makes perfect sense that we should find relationship so fundamental to our existence. The phrase and the Word was God has a very specific meaning. It's not just describing His station in the world. It's talking about His essence. It's an essence statement. That's why there's no direct article there. If it were talking about identity in some way, it would say the Word was the God. But it doesn't say that. It just says God was the Word. And so it's telling us that there's an essence quality here to this idea of the Word Himself. Now, if you go to Colossians chapter 1, and I would encourage you to read that text at your convenience, or today if you get tired of listening to me, it tells you directly that there are only two categories in the world. In the whole of reality, there are two categories. Now, I'm going to use some $2 words and then I'll explain them. One of them is necessary. That means that something exists because its essence is to exist. It can't not exist. There's only one necessary being in the universe, and that's God Himself. The other is another $2 word, contingent. That means that the thing has some thing that it depends upon for its existence. Those are the only two categories in the whole of reality. And God occupies one, and everything else occupies the other. So when it says the Word was God, that's telling us that the Word occupied the category of the maker, the necessary, not the contingent. Man, this text is so deep. They're fat books. I've got some of them written about just these few verses that we have read today. The letter to the Hebrews says the same thing, essentially saying that through whom God made the worlds, speaking of Jesus, the Son. There are mathematically, we think, 10 octillion. Now, octillion's a very big number. I don't even know how to count it. I don't even know how many zeros octillion is. But 10 octillion stars that we think are visible in the universe. And Genesis says, and He made the stars also. He made the stars also. So, there is a quality of God that necessitates God becoming flesh. In order for us to even understand, that's why John says what he does, that Jesus, the Word becoming flesh, has made God known. There's an element about God that we just could not know, were it not for the fact that Jesus has come. And there's a certain quality of God himself that applies to this that just is kind of mind-bending in a way, in that God has made himself somewhat hidden from us. He is. Why is that? I was reading an article many years ago, and it just stuck with me. There's a guy by the name of George Steinmetz. You may not know who that is. I didn't know who it was till I caught the article. George Steinmetz was one of the original idea people behind electrical generation. Back when there was a huge debate between Thomas Edison and Nikola Tesla as to what kind of electricity this country would have, whether AC or DC. Edison wanted DC, so you know what he did? He said, I know what I'll do. I'll show you how dangerous AC current is. I'll hook an elephant up to 2 electrodes and kill it with AC current. So that's what he did, and then he filmed it so that everybody could see the elephant twitching and dying by virtue of being electrocuted with AC current. Never mind the fact that you could have done the same thing with DC current and it would have had the same effect, but that Edison was trying to make a point. Well, AC current's what we've got, and the reason for that is it travels over long distances better than DC current, and you can step the voltages up and down, which you see that substation up there on the end of the road next to 122. That's what it's doing. It's raising and lowering current so that you have something the vacuum cleaner will operate off of when you plug it in. Well, George Steinmetz was called into the new generation facility in upstate New York where they had these generators, and one of them was malfunctioning, and so he goes in, he makes a mark on the generator with some chalk, and then he cuts a hole in the generator where the chalk is, repairs the generator, and he sends them a bill, $1,000. And so GE said, well, wait a minute, that's an awful lot of money. I mean, all you did was make a circle on the generator with some chalk. Somebody else did all the work. So we need you to itemize that bill for us. So he said, okay. So he sent him a bill back, and it says on there, marking the generator with chalk, $1, knowing where to mark it, $999. There was a humility there. He didn't want to blow his horn. There was a hiddenness to the fact that he had all this knowledge that made him able to mark the generator with the chalk. God is like that. You don't get a microscope out and see a single-celled animal drifting about. You don't look up at a planet and then somewhere in some little fine print at the bottom it says made by Yahweh. You don't see that anywhere. Why is it that God is so hidden? There's a certain humility here. There's a certain humility as to why God, and it's one of the most frustrating aspects for people who don't believe that I can think of. How come God doesn't just make himself known? Why didn't he make the stars arrange in the sky that says, Yahweh, I'm here? He doesn't do that. He remains hidden for a reason. He wants us to pursue him a little bit, to want to have a relationship with him. The context here of this text is very Jewish, even though it's written to a Greek audience. Very fascinating. The context is light. He says Jesus is the light of the world. That's a Jewish idea. If you go back in history and you say, well, what was important to the Jews? It was light. What was important to the Greeks? It was wisdom. What was important to the Romans? It was law and order. Those were the categories. And, we're living in this country here today on this Memorial Day weekend. All three of those contribute to who we are as Americans. But for the Hebrew, light was the big feature. Light is an interesting thing when you think about it. We don't even understand exactly what it is. I mean, you see these light bulbs glowing because the filament's been heated to a certain temperature and it gives off radiation in the form of light. But look between the bulb and the carpet, you don't see anything at all. I mean, I'm looking at your faces, you're looking at mine, I hope, and I don't see anything between us. Light itself has no being, it's invisible, and yet we see the effects of it. And you know what's interesting about that? If you were to darken this room fully, if you turn on one light, all the darkness goes away. But darkness is not a thing. Light is a thing, and darkness always flees from it. That's why you see this text talking about he was the light of the world. He was the light that excluded the darkness that was already here. Now, why the Word? That's fascinating. Why did God inspire John to speak of it in this way? The reason is he's writing a document to a Greek audience, a Greek-speaking audience. For them, the Word had a powerful meaning. The word in Greek there is logos. All right? Lots of really egg-headed Greek philosophers had spoken about the logos long before John wrote this article, before John wrote this text. They said, Plato said there's a goodness, a good, capital G, good, that exists. But how would we know it? And Plato's idea was the logos would have to be here and reveal to us what the good is. Well, that's exactly what John is pointing to. He's saying the logos, the Word, has revealed to us who God is. Well, why the Word, though? Because the words are connected with intellect. Think for just a minute about anything you can think of. It doesn't matter what it is, a dog, a cat, a meal, the blackberries back there, a cup of coffee, your friend, the window, the breeze. It makes no difference. You cannot think about something without words attached to it. It's not possible. And the Bible talks about God upholding everything by the word of His power. The Bible also speaks in the Psalms of God speaking things into existence. The word means a lot more than we understand it to mean. And God's very reason and wisdom is connected to words. Words. So the maker, the text tells us, comes back to the thing made, and the thing made doesn't recognize him at all. Think about that for just a minute. I remember when I was a kid, the Folgers commercials. And I remember it was always having to do with, especially the later ones, somebody would come home from college or somebody come home from the military or whatever, and they would wake up in their family's home, and that they would get up before everybody else did and make coffee, and the best part of waking up was Folgers in your cup. So that everybody would come into the kitchen and everybody would hug. And think about what would happen in the commercial. It wouldn't be nearly as effective as if everybody walked into the kitchen with the person who's standing there making the Folgers coffee and they say, "Who are you?" It just wouldn't have the heartstring pull, would it? Well, that's exactly what happened to God, right? God comes into the very people He has made, not only the people in general, but His people. And they don't know who He is. They don't even recognize Him. I mean, if ever there was a statement about what it is to be lost, that God is and we don't recognize Him at all, He made us and we don't know who He is. Think about that from the standpoint of the Folgers commercial. I mean, there's the person's son, the family's son. They don't know who He is. Who are you? Jesus came to the people that He had loved. Remember what He said. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who have stoned the prophets and killed all those who were sent to you, how often I would have been willing to gather you as a hen gathers her brood, but you would not. Not you could not, you would not. Well, what's that about? I mean, why is it that they weren't ready to recognize Him? Was it that they just weren't ready? I don't think so. I think a lot of people knew that it was time for the Messiah to come. Maybe they thought, like a lot of people in our culture think, I can't come into God's presence until I've cleaned myself up, until I've made myself available to be presentable to God. Or maybe, like a lot of people in our day, they're just so caught up in daily living that the whole idea of knowing God is not even important to them. I mean, it just looks so much like what the text says by the same writer in the book of the Revelation. Jesus says, "Behold, I'm standing at the door knocking, and if anybody will open that door, I'll come in." There's a whole sense here of what it is to come home. Jesus came to His home, and nobody knew who He was but 12, who He picked. Revised Standard Version, I think, handles the last passage that we read today better than any other translation. It says this: "No one has ever seen God. It is God, the only Son, who is close to the Father's heart, who has, and the Word, I love this word, declared him. In other words, Jesus, the Word become flesh, declares God to us in a way that nothing else could have done. The Greek is even stronger. Literally, it says God, no one has ever seen, never. It says it makes it a double negative. No one has ever seen, never. The only begotten God, the being who is in the breast of the Father, has declared him, the Greek says. Now let me ask you a question. Have you ever been yourself, think about your past history, utterly rejected by anybody? Have you ever had that sense of real rejection? Now I remember one of my greatest fears when I saw Becky for the first time was that I would say something to her and that she would look at me and say, no, ain't gonna happen. That was really a fear I had when I remember Karen Blunt showing me Becky in the mall parking lot in Waycross, Georgia. And I thought, boy, she is pretty. And I thought, I'm gonna go up and try to meet her. The thought that she might turn to me and say, ain't gonna happen, was a very real fear. But compared to what I'm talking about, that's a minor rejection. Let me paint a picture for you, a word picture here, and just think about this for a minute. Let's say you've got somebody you really care about deeply, and they're away, and you're at home, and you decide, I'm going to do something really nice for them. I'm going to bake them a cake. And you know what cake they really like, so you get all the ingredients together. They're not there, they don't know any of this is happening. And you get in the kitchen and you fill the kitchen up with all those nice smells, and flour spilled all over the place, pots and pans stacked up in the sink, and the person for whom you've made this cake comes home. And all the smells are in there. The cake is sitting under this glass, it's done, they can see it, and they look at you and they say, why did you do that? I didn't want a cake. Now, how would that feel? I think that sense of rejection where you've offered something of yourself to them in the deepest possible way, just because you cared about them, and they turn straight to you and they'd say, why did you do that? I didn't want that. That's exactly what the whole world has done to God. God has made us a cake. He's given us this world. He's given us life. He's given us breath. He's given us food. He's given us himself. And said, if you'll believe in me, you can live forever. Like you were talking about, Brad, this morning. There's a wonderful place that you can go if you want. I'm giving it to you. And we've turned to him and we said, I don't want it. I'm not interested. I'll tell you, the Old Testament is exactly what I think G.K. Chesterton says it is. It looks to him like, this was his comment, not mine, I wish I'd thought of it, like a father who's lost his children, who's looking for them. That's who God is. That's why God has come to us in Jesus, back to his home. He made it to try to draw us back to our home, which ultimately is in him and no place else. That's why the Word became flesh. That's the meaning of this text. I don't know where everybody is today, but if I've said anything at all